How are
Good, how are you?
you? I'm doing pretty well, pretty well.
So I think this first one, this may sound like a rather simple question to you, but I think it's something a lot of people don't understand. So can you tell me some of the biggest reasons we see a lack of Black and minority engagement at the polls every year?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for caring about these issues as a young person. We need more young people that are focused on serious things and not just on verses. Um, Secondly, thank you for having me. You know, I care about this subject because my activism and much of my leadership was prompted by voter registration. Um, Interesting thing happened. I wrote about this in one of my books. When I was in high school, the rules of the school required that students register to vote in student government elections, which was for the school an exercise in civic education. The school's philosophy was the more they could get us as high school students to behave the way we would have to behave as adults, the more likely it would be that we'd be more responsible adults. And so, in the first instance, I think civic education and voting and the emphasis on democratic practices should be taught much more effectively in schools. And so I grew up in a school where that was just embedded in the culture and the curriculum. Now, what's interesting is that our school was about 25% Black and 75% white. And I ran for student government president and lost primarily because most of the Black students weren't registered. And it was strange to us that we all went to the same school and the white people seemed to know and the Black people did not seem to know. And so we began, this was 1968, we began looking around the school to see, well, what else do white people know that Black people don't know? And how is it that two groups of people can literally eat in the same cafeteria, play in the same gym, go to the same classes, and not be aware of the same information? And so we formed one of the first high school Black student unions in America. And the impetus behind that organization was to make sure Black students knew stuff, period. I mean, we weren't really angry per se, but we were very concerned that there may be other things that Black people needed to know that we didn't know. And so if you look at the original language of the Black Student Union from Montclair High School in 1968, that was the purpose. And we let white people join, one, because we had to, but two, because the objective, we weren't anti-white, we were just wanting Black people to get as much as they could out of the experience at our school. And so that shaped my perspective on activism and being proactive and being involved. Now, the other interesting thing is that shortly thereafter, during that same year, a Black woman decided to run for county office. She lived up the street from the high school. She was active in the PTA. And so my first community project was voter registration. And I, as a teenager, along with a few of my friends, went around town making sure Black people were registered to elect this Black woman who became the first Black person elected on the county level. She became the first woman elected in the state legislature, and she became the first Black woman elected in the state Senate. Her name was Dr. Winona Lippman, a brilliant woman. But that's how I first got involved in activism and community. So I think to your answer, to your question, one, I don't think there's enough emphasis in school. Two, I don't think there's enough emphasis in the community, starting with our families and our churches. And then I also think that there's a disconnect between our understanding of government and politics and what it really is all about. Um, and so that's why I think what you're doing is so important, because we need to understand that the quality of our lives in many ways is controlled by government policy, and the people who are in those positions make those decisions. You know, I lived in a town where most of the black people lived in one section and the white people lived in a different section. And when you looked at the parks, I cared about the parks because I played baseball and basketball. When you looked at just the parks on our side of town were run down, the grass was brown, the basketball courts were lopsided. You know, when the basketball rims were broken or the nets were missing, we'd have to fix them ourselves. And then you go to the upper part of town and you'd see like country club parks. And we learned early that the people who made those decisions were the politicians that were elected to office, and they determined which parks were nice and which parks weren't nice, which schools got fixed, which schools that didn't get fixed. And so I think it's on that level, not the TV stars, you know, not the national personalities, but it's on a day-to-day level. Right here in Central Jersey, there are decisions made about who fixes the roads or what roads get fixed, what neighborhoods get plowed when it snows, you know, who gets garbage picked up and doesn't get garbage picked up. I mean, these are the basic day-to-day quality of life issues that are controlled by local politicians. And I think we need more emphasis on the relationship between government and our day-to-day lives, and not just focus on the military and national community, even though those are important. Much more than we realize is control of government. I couldn't put a deck on my house without getting permission from City Hall. People who work at City Hall are hired by the people we elect. So these are the kinds of messages I think we people. And if we do, then we'll be able to motivate more people, because the issues that would drive them to vote would be much closer to home. So yeah, that's a big part of it.
Got it. So aside from that lack of information, in terms of going to more about voter ID laws, can you tell me how any organizations or politicians or individuals you know are working to remove the obstacles put in place by those laws?
Well, if you read the book, which is, I think, the best written book on voting in America, called The Right to Vote. It's a marvelous book. It just talks about the history of voting in the country. What you will learn from that book, and what you'll see if you really observe carefully, is that historically, the people who have advocated for expanding the franchise or expanding the right to vote have been the people who felt that they would benefit politically from that expansion. And the people who have opposed making voting more accessible and making it more available are those who thought that that expansion would impact them negatively on election day. See what I mean?
Right.
So Democrats and Republicans have been equal opportunity culprits as it relates to increasing or decreasing the franchise. So when the age to vote was lowered from 21 to 18, the people who opposed it were the people who assumed that people between 18 and 21 would not vote for them. And the people who supported it were people who believed that having 18 to 21-year-olds would increase their likelihood of winning elections. The people who were for blacks voting were the people who thought that if black people had the right to vote, that we would vote for them. And the people who opposed it for the same reason. The people who opposed women voting were people who thought women wouldn't vote for them. And so if you look at the history of America over the last 250 some odd years, what you'll see is that each party or each side of the political world has either opposed or supported expanding or making voting easier, depending on political outcomes. See, that's why organizations like the NAACP and the League of Women Voters and other nonpartisan organizations are critical, because the question should not be, will this help me win or will this help my party? The question should be, is this right for democracy? And is this the right thing to do? So what's interesting about voter ID, I was in charge of the 2004 presidential election. And before the voter ID issue really became the hot issue, in 2004, the issue was the voting machine itself. Because in the year 2000, the election was so close and the ballots in Florida couldn't be detected because they had these punch cards. And so we spent about $2.3 billion giving states money to buy new voting equipment. But if you take a state like Georgia, which at that time was essentially a Democratic state, in Georgia, everybody had been used to showing photo ID when they voted. Everybody in Georgia. And what's happened in recent years, again, is that the voter ID issue has become one identified with creating barriers for people to vote. And I promise you, whenever you see a potential barrier, the people behind the construction of the barrier are the people who believe that the barrier will help them politically. I personally don't believe that photo ID is in and of itself a barrier to voting or undemocratic, because we've been doing it in so many places. But I do believe it's been manipulated and used in various places. And that's why I think we need national voting standards, because today we treat elections as though we're a state that's just next to another state as opposed to a nation. You know, I went to Venice 2004 to represent this country at a global conference on democracy. And what I discovered there was really embarrassing, because many of the former communist Eastern European countries that had just become democracies were literally much better at managing voting than we are. India had a much more sophisticated, unified national voting system than we do. And India has over 1 billion people, Mexico. And so, you know, I left there feeling a bit embarrassed, because some of the countries that we kind of thought we were superior to were actually doing a better job at the core democratic practice of voting.
Moving on from there, this one is a little political, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But so if President Trump continues to succeed in slowing the mail system and cheat mail-in votes, is there anything we can do to circumvent that? Or if not, what is our next step?
Yeah, well, I think, as most people know, the United States Postal Service is a troubled organization, and that's not new. My wife just told me last week that someone she knew mailed a letter or a package to someone else. I think her brother. Her brother mailed a package to her sister. Her brother's in Virginia, her sister's in New Jersey, and it took 4 weeks to arrive. You know, I mean, you have to know that if the Postal Service were really efficient, there would have been no room for UPS or Federal Express. I mean, the fact is, whole industries have grown up taking advantage of the weaknesses of the postal system. That's just a fact. And that's exacerbated by the fact that we now don't mail as much. We do email, and we have DocuSign. So you can sign a legal document electronically. We have PDF attachments. And so there's just not as great a need for the post office as there used to be. So having said that, here you have an organization that is shifting in its purpose and its function, in its business model. And now you have a pandemic, which is going to make it mandatory that many, many people vote by mail. Well, the state of Oregon has been a vote by mail state for years. 100%, they have no voting machines at all. In our state, in the state of New Jersey, we have essentially three options. You can ask for an absentee ballot. The state Secretary of State is going to mail a ballot to every citizen, and then there'll be polling places that you can go and vote physically. If the Postal Service is incapable of sending a package, then you have to wonder if the Postal Service really has the capacity to service an election in an efficient way. So I am concerned. I think the members of Congress that are concerned are trying to get more resources to the post office and the Postal Service to ensure that they have the ability to actually service the country, assuming that we'll have more mail-in ballots than ever before. But I don't want to discourage you, you know, but you're young, so you shouldn't get discouraged. The way we vote on election day, November 4th, and the role of the Postal Service is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the managing of elections. We have 400,000 polling places in the country. We've never had enough poll workers, and most poll workers, when I was in office back in 2004, I think the average age of a poll worker was 65 years old. So we don't have enough poll workers. We vote on Tuesday. I urge Congress to pass a law to make Election Day a holiday so people don't have to choose between going to work and going to vote. Sometimes people go to work, and by the time they get done, it's just too late to vote. I urged, if we didn't have a holiday, I urge corporations, Oprah Winfrey has done this, by the way, to give their employees a day off so they can vote on Election Day. One of my recommendations as chair of the Elections Commission was to have voting on weekends. So people don't really have to take off from work, since most people work during the week. Early voting was something I advocated for, and thank God that's now present in most places. But the real tragedy in this country around voting has to do with the fact that there is no training, there's no certification, there's no degree, there's no school you can go to learn how to manage an election. And so elections administration, the people who run elections in this country, who are in charge of the counting, who are in charge of the poll workers, who are in charge of determining how many votes were cast, the real tragedy is that there's no training. And in most states, what you'll find is that it's Harry's cousin. If Harry's the mayor, his cousin is in charge of elections. You know, if Mary is the county commissioner, you know, her niece. It's a very unprofessional, unsophisticated, unregulated industry. And it's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment for a country that has spent money and dropped bombs all over the world in the name of promoting democracy. And the most fundamental activity in a democracy is the right to cast a ballot, free and fair elections. And it's our dirty little secret, you know? It's our dirty little secret. And when I was in Washington, what I discovered was that the people who were elected, members of Congress and the Senate, once they took their oath of office, they no longer cared about the system, because the implicit assumption is if the system produced them, how bad could it be? So we have. I'll give you another little dirty little secret on the national level. We don't know how many people vote for president. We don't know. There's no way to find out. And that's for two reasons. Because when I go to vote, if I pull the lever, push the button for president, if the machine malfunctions and my vote just does not count, there is no investigation, there is no research being done into why that happened. So let's say in your town, where do you live, in Edison?
Actually, I live in Woodridge now.
Okay. So let's say 100 people vote on election day, right? Let's say 100 people show up to the polls on election day. And let's say uh, that at the end of the day, when they count how many people voted for President Trump, and they get 40, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they count how many people voted for Vice President Biden, and they get 45. What they report is 40 for Trump and 45 for Biden. What happened to the other 5? We don't know.
Right.
And that's in every town, in every county, in every state across the country, which means that on any given presidential election, we estimated when I was in office that we lost 1 to 2 million votes, just didn't know where they went. We didn't know if it was a machine. We didn't know if people just went into the polling booth and just didn't vote for president. It's called the undercount. And we have no sense, what is an acceptable number of votes to get lost to satisfy our need for a free and fair election. So, listen, I could teach a whole course on this. I'm not going to do it today. But what I'm telling you is that this postal issue is not the biggest challenge we have. And I think at the end of the day, what's going to happen this November that's most painful is that it'll probably take longer to determine who won the election than it normally takes. It's going to frustrate people, and it's going to create conspiracy theories and all kinds of animosity. So you're fastening your seatbelt. It's going to be an interesting month in November.
Oh man, I'm discouraged.
Well, it's something. Listen, it's. I mean, I smile about it, but I was so frustrated in Washington. I resigned from my job 2.5 years early because I realized the politicians just don't care. They don't care unless it's a close race. And then if it's a close race, they try to go deep into the process. But the goal is for them to win. And I'm saying that somebody has got to be working on these issues who doesn't have a personal interest in the outcome, you see?
Right.
So you hang in there, keep doing what you're doing.
All right, so shifting focus a little, some of those who lived through the 60s, you were in civil rights yourself, are saying the millennials who are leading the charge right now in terms of protests aren't organized enough. Do you think that's true? And how do you think the millennial generation can do better to make change?
Well, I think the social protest movement today is getting more and more organized every day. And I think that when my generation says that the millennials are not organized enough, first of all, most of them weren't organized or even active. So that's number one. But they're generalizing. There's Sean King, who's very organized. Sean King is one of the activists that came out of the Ferguson conflict. And Sean King has decided that his focus is going to be to travel around the country and help as many of the 2,300 district attorneys who are running for office either stay in office, leave office, or be elected to office. That's very focused. It's very focused. Much of the social protest is aimed at police reform. Now, they may not say it the way we say it, but I think the general consensus is policing in America has to change. And I think it's a bit arrogant to assume that the millennials or the protesters or the activists must have all of the answers. Yes, I would love to see a little more strategy. And I think as the weeks and the months have unfolded, we've seen more and more strategy. The young guys in the National Basketball Association, they responded impulsively to what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They walked off the court, and then they had meetings, one of which was with President Obama, and they started thinking strategy, and they went back on the court. Now they're doing some different things. So I'm not overly critical of the young activists And what I've tried to do is to help them with strategy to the extent that I've been asked to. But I think what has been significant is that this generation of young people has at least made it clear that they care about the issue of social justice. And they have put elected officials on notice that they're not going to allow young women like Breonna Taylor to be killed in their own homes and say and do nothing. And so organization strategy will evolve and emerge, and hopefully the older people that are critical will be less critical and make themselves more available to help with strategy if they know how to do it themselves.
All right, so as you mentioned, a lot of millennials have been attacking police reform, but of course there is far more injustice in the system past policing as well. So do you think it makes sense to focus on police reform, or is there something else we should be speaking to more in the bigger picture?
That's a great question. I do think police reform is a critical issue. In 1967, there was a presidential commission called the Kerner Commission. And the Kerner Commission was appointed by the president to determine why there were so many riots and other forms of rebellion in cities around the country. And when the Kerner Commission, which was chaired by a governor, I think from Michigan, came back, one of the things the Kerner Commission said was that we basically live in two Americas, one black, one white, and it pointed to police brutality as a core issue impacting the country in general and race relations in particular. I think the issue of police behavior, police philosophy, and policing is a critical issue. And I think it has to be addressed. These people work for us. They have badges and guns. They are the authority of the government. And I think the way they are trained, the way they are hired, the way they are monitored, the way they are evaluated, the way they are promoted, the way they are rewarded is in the public interest. I was in China a few years ago, and in China, we visited Tiananmen Square, where the democratic uprising was forcefully put down by law enforcement there. And the guards that stand along the pathway from the outside on the street inside to Tiananmen Square, they stand there like statues. And the tour guide said to us, "Don't look them in the eye," and that's a bit startling. He said, "No, don't. If you look them in the eye, it could be interpreted as disrespectful or worse." Well, that's China, and I was just visiting China, but who would want armed police officers with badges and guns, who you can't speak to and who you can't look in the eye? These people, it's almost as if they're not human. So I do think I have spent many days of my life protesting police misconduct, police brutality, and it's particularly disheartening when there is such a disparate treatment when you look at how a white person's treated versus how a black person's treated. How can a white guy go into a church in South Carolina and kill 7 or 8 people, and when the police show up, they take him to Burger King, and a black guy, passes a bad $20 bill, ends up dead? I mean, it's unconscionable to think that policing could be so different for blacks, particularly in the city, and whites, especially in the suburbs. So yes, I think. However, I do think, to the point of your question, the larger issue of fairness and justice in society is certainly, it exceeds the issue of policing. You have to look at schools and education. You have to look at healthcare disparities and why, this little virus that doesn't, that doesn't have a brain, doesn't have eyes, the virus is just a virus, but how the virus found its way to Black people in disproportionately high numbers than white people. We have to look at that. We have to look at housing and how a city like Flint, Michigan could be impacted by lead in all the pipes in all the city. And that would never happen in a place like Holland, Michigan. So yes, we have to critique the country, and we have to demonstrate across party lines and across racial lines and across economic lines a commitment to helping America be what America always said America wanted to be.
Awesome. Okay, I do have one more question. In a more spiritual sense, I'd like to ask you, what can we Black people do to keep our sense of inner peace and continue to exude warmth and love as we still watch our brothers and sisters get hurt and beaten down by the system?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to do what we've always done. We've always had a sense of our connection to God. If we didn't have that, if we needed the affirmation or the support or the love of the largest society, we would have checked out of here long ago. But we always had a sense that there is a God somewhere. God guided us from slavery to freedom. God protected us when we fought for civil rights. And we've lost our appreciation as a people, as a culture, for how good God has been to us. That's what sustained the Jews. The Jews have been run out of everywhere they've been, everywhere. But Jewish culture and Jewish religion has sustained them. We have to remember who we are. We have to also know our own history and understand the legacy we bring from Africa. Africans were industrious, creative, dynamic people, and a lot of that heritage has been lost. But when you go to Nigeria, when you go to Ghana, when you go to Niger, when you see Africa prior to slavery, then you understand the greatness that we have from the perspective of heritage. And then we have to have moral standards that protect us from succumbing to the level of our enemy. That was the genius of Dr. King. Dr. King said, Jesus taught us that you don't return hatred with hatred, you return hatred with love. And the power of love and the power of redemption and the power of service ultimately wins out over hatred. So that's how we do it. It's a moral, philosophical, theological grounding. And unfortunately, many of us today have kind of bought into consumer culture. We identify our ultimate worth with the things we own. We have failed to understand the difference between God and religion. And so if we get turned off by the church, we get turned off by God. And so I think it's really true that while we are watching now, right before our very eyes, incidents of hatred, betrayal, and abuse, it's still true that today it's better for Black people than it's ever been. Today, America is still affording us more opportunities. We have more access. I mean, it was rough back in the day, and it's rough now, but it's not as rough as it was then. It's not as rough as it was when white vigilantes had the right to just drag you back into slavery, and they were having lynchings downtown. In 1921, they burned out a whole Black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 1919, they burned out a whole neighborhood in Chicago. So, it's tough, but if our grandparents could make it through what they made it through, we certainly can make it through what we're going through.
That is perfect. Thank you.
All right, my dear. Keep up the good work.
I will.
God bless you.